Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I once again rise in the House to speak to Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. Bill C-45 would provide legal access to cannabis for adults and would control and regulate its production, distribution, and sale. Mr. Speaker, cannabis is and has been an illegal drug in Canada for 94 years. For those doing the math, that means it's been prohibited since 1923. I have a number of concerns with the piece of legislation before us today, Mr. Speaker. I'll list a few and then go into detail on all of them, and I believe that it will take to the bulk of my 10 minutes. Between the easy and direct pot access for children and youth to the cost of implementation, the taxation, revenue sharing, and allocation, and the compromising of international law and treaty obligations, and the risk of jeopardizing of relationships with our allies, including the U.S., Great Britain, and others. Mr. Speaker, there is quite a lot to digest here, and I'm extremely concerned that this legislation is going to be passed before any of these questions are answered. Polls would suggest that as Canadians learn more about the details of the Liberals' plan to legalize marijuana and the potential harmful impacts that may follow, some are having second thoughts. This is especially true when it comes to the legal age for buying marijuana, Mr. Speaker. A whopping 58% of Canadians surveyed feel that the legal age should be higher than the age the federal government has set, which is 18. That's more than 2 in 5 Canadians that disagree with the government's current trajectory, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's marijuana bill is a promise to pot smokers, not to parents, and there are so many unanswered questions here. And it's enabling children to have direct and easy access to pot. They like to say that this will somehow, their piece of legislation will make it harder for children to get their hands on marijuana. But let's be very clear, Mr. Speaker, this is not in any way going to decrease the amount of usage by our children, and indeed allowing a 12-year-old the permission or to be able to carry up to 5 grams of marijuana is unacceptable. Canada has the highest rates of cannabis use of any country in the world. We're not disputing that. In 2015, use among youth aged 15 to 19 was 21%, while use among young adults aged 20 to 24 was 30%. As we get closer to 2018, the self-imposed legislation date put forward by the Liberal government, we need to recognize the many unknowns with this legislation, which will be the bulk of my speech, Mr. Speaker. 41% of Canadians feel Ottawa is rushing this legislation process, while 53% said they feel that the federal government is underestimating the overall impact on Canadian society. I know I'm throwing a lot of statistics at you, Mr. Speaker, but I think it's important to underscore how Canadians are feeling on something as important as a drug that will impact the health and safety of all of Canadians. The Prime Minister must also be clear in how we sell this to our international parties. As mentioned earlier on, Canada is one of more than 150 parties to 3 United Nations drug control conventions: the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and the 1988 Conventions Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances. These are not to be taken lightly, Mr. Speaker. A government memo came out last year stated that Canada will need to explore how to inform the international community and take the steps needed to adjust its obligations under these investigations. What does that mean, Mr. Speaker? Well, in order to withdraw from any of these treaties, Canada must do so before July 1st of this year. So when will they signal the intent to do so, or have they already? We will be the first G7 country in the world to take steps to legalizing this drug, and yet we still can't answer the most basic questions, Mr. Speaker. What does it mean for someone crossing the border who may have consumed cannabis earlier that day or even a couple days previously? Mr. Speaker, if a U.S. Customs officer asks a Canadian that is going through the border whether they consumed, have they consumed at any time or within the current time, within the last 48 hours or 24 hours, marijuana, they will be deemed inadmissible. They could be detained. Will this affect border times? Will more resources be dedicated to dealing with this issue? Mr. Speaker, there's even reason to believe that the legislation around impaired driving may be unconstitutional. The National Post has highlighted this point by saying that science has yet to establish a solid link between a given level of THC concentration in a driver's blood or saliva and their level of impairment. I'll say this again, as I've talked to it before, is that impairment with THC or cannabis is completely different than impairment with alcohol. And to this date, Mr. Speaker, despite all of the questions that we've asked, all of the questions that I've asked, this government has been unable to be able to give us what level of THC needs to be in the bloodstream to be determined that you are impaired. Impaired driving is a leading criminal cause of death in Canada, and we can only expect these numbers to increase when marijuana is legalized. There are serious questions also being asked about our transportation industry. I've stood in the House many times before explaining that my background, 22 years in the aviation industry, as well as working with many, many organizations, whether it is road, whether it is rail, whether it is marine or aviation, these groups will all have serious concerns over this legislation. There are tens of thousands of commercial trucks on the highways and roadways of our provinces, of our communities. What certainty is the government putting forth to communities that have these trucks going through at all hours of the day? What steps is this government taking to ensure that the conductor or engineer of a train hauling hazardous materials through our communities, or that the pilots flying your family and mine have not consumed marijuana? What are we saying to the organizations that employ these people? Mr. Speaker, is the government going to provide additional resources? Are we going to still mandate that drug testing is required? How do these companies that we trust to operate safely and efficiently police their employees? On the other side of that, we've also heard serious concerns from our insurance and mortgage industry. When a property is sold, there is a purchase contract in place as well as a property disclosure that is typically required. The exact wording from the statement is, are you aware if the premises have been used as a marijuana grow operation or to manufacture illegal drugs? It does not state quantity or whether it was a legal or illegal operation, simply whether there was any marijuana grown on that property. Once an owner has knowledge of this, they are required to disclose it to any subsequent purchaser, which will drastically affect the marketability of that property. Furthermore, the stigma will remain attached to the property for the life of the home and potentially onward. Financing options have been for properties that have had marijuana grown on them have become almost obsolete. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, insurance companies that underwrite the mortgages in Canada, many of them are in the United States, and they have chosen and have said that they do not want to touch this bill and do not want to see it go through. Most of our major banks will no longer allow it, and few smaller credit unions who will still consider are typically charging higher premiums due to the risk management. A Phase 1 environmental assessment is always required to determine the potential damage to a home, and then all remediation is to be completed prior to obtaining a new occupancy permit. This process can cost tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, through you I ask, has the Liberal government done a thorough analysis and consulted the mortgage insurance brokers, the transportation organizations on the impact of this legislation? I think I have been very clear on my points today. The legislation is momentous. I don't have to say it is very dramatic. We are in uncharted territory, and if this legislation is passed, the world will be looking at Canada's model. And what will they find are flaws that put our health and safety of Canadians at risk? I thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the questions.